meet the Mets. Step right up and greet the
And how you doing? How you living? How you feeling, folks? Back for another episode of City Night Lights. Now, of course, I'm your favorite idiot number 0. My name's Zach, and as always, glad to be back in the mic talking to you guys. Now, I know it's been a little while. I've taken pretty much a 2-month hiatus, but we're getting back into things. I want to get a little bit more consistent. I feel like I say that a lot, but hopefully I mean it this time. We'll see what happens, but this is going to be a fun episode. I kind of wanted to talk about my Mets outlook on this free agency period in this 2026 free agency. I think there's going to be a lot of moving pieces. It's definitely going to be a slower free agency than I think most of us are accustomed to, and really kind of a weirdly quiet one. We're very used to hearing all of the Will Ponce plans not being very closely guarded to the chest. So having Steve Cohen, kind of not let us know what the exact plan is for this year, really leaving that up to some speculation, I think that makes it a little bit more fun for me, and it's going to be an interesting offseason. So with that being said, what we're going to do is we'll quickly talk about the departures, some movable assets we have, a little bit of arbitration dealings, what that's going to look like. And then, I'm just going to quickly talk about some potential guys, some names of people that I could see the Mets maybe deciding they want to go out, try to deal for, try to pick up in free agency. And then I'm going to give you my free agency plan for the Mets for this 2026 offseason. So with that being said, we will just get right into it. So the Mets are projected to have about $80 to $100 million in free agency cap room freeing up this season. We had a lot of big departures like Edwin Diaz is $21.5 million, Pete Alonso's $30 million, Starling Marte's $20.5 million. So we're seeing a lot of guys come off the books, a lot of big money. And just to quickly hit up some of the other players who are going to be departing in this free agency period, we're going to see Jesse Winker leaving, Griffin Canning leaving, Ryan Stanek, Jose Siri, Drew Smith, and then, of course, all of the deadline guys like Tyler Rogers, Cedric Mullins, Ryan Hazley, and Gregory Soto. Now, that's a lot of guys. I know we're going to have a lot of open roster spots, specifically in the bullpen, losing Drew Smith, losing Ryan Stanek, Rogers, Hazley, Soto. That's 5 guys right there that we're going to be losing out of the pen. So clearly the pen is going to be something that we need to address this offseason. Now, there are some movable assets. We do have Brandon Nimmo. He's got a $20.5 million deal until 2031. Maybe he's, going to step into that DH role for us and become our true DH, but I don't know how to feel about the $20.5 million. I mean, Nimmo has been a great hitter. I love seeing him at the bat, but his just inability to field this last season, he really looked like a stick in the outfield for a guy who has been phenomenal out there before. It's just rough to see. He's getting older. He's way more injury prone. So I have a hard time seeing them really move off of him, but I think it is a possibility. And another guy, I have a hard time seeing them move off of him, but I think it is a possibility. And that's Jeff McNeil. Someone who just had thoracic arm surgery. Didn't think that was a major thing for batters, but with this new development, I feel like it's going to be kind of hard to trade a guy where, some teams would go, hey, he's a average level baseball player. We could bring him in. We only got to pay him $10 million for the year. We pay him another 10 to 5 the year after. That's 2 years for an average to slightly above average baseball player. A lot of teams would eat that up, teams like the Royals, teams like the Guardians. But it seems like with this surgery, that might be kind of held up. So I'm very intrigued to see what the Jeff McNeil saga looks like this offseason. But odds are he's going to be coming into spring training with the New York Mets. Now we'll move quickly onto arbitration. And arbitration is a godsend for the Mets because, thank God, David Peterson will be coming back for another year. This is a guy who really has been phenomenal for the Mets for the last 2 years. Someone that the Mets need on this starting staff. I mean, without him this last season, our best pitcher is Clay Holmes, and Clay Holmes didn't have a terrible year, but his inability to get past or really get to the 6th inning severely hampered the Mets in their ability to pitch consistently throughout the season, and that was a big trend for the entire pitching staff. One of the only guys who was consistently getting to 6 innings, David Peterson. So I'm glad that we're going to bring him back. That shouldn't be an issue. Hopefully we look to extend him a little bit longer term. I think this is a guy who's hopefully going to be on the Mets for the near future, for at least a couple more years, because I think this is David Peterson really is a player that the Mets would be sorry to lose out on. He's been there for us. He's been dependable, and that's the type of pitcher that we need in this staff right now. Then the other two guys we would see coming up on arbitration is Luis Torrens, a great defensive catcher. Love to have him back. No real hitting ability, but just a fun player to have. And then Tyrone Taylor, defensive outfielder. I think it's going to cost us about $3 million in ARB. I don't know if it's worth keeping him. I think it might be okay to go, hey guys, let's move off of Tyrone Taylor. Let's pick up Jose Siri on maybe a 2-year, $9 million deal. I would feel a little bit more comfortable in the talent of Jose Siri rather than really trotting out Tyrone Taylor as another role player who's just kind of there, kind of just existing. Now, that's really the very basic beginning of this offseason, getting a good background. Who's leaving, who's coming back, who might be movable. And, obviously talking about the two guys that'll be movable. I didn't even mention Mauricio, Vientos, Acuna Jr. I mean, prospects to be moved. I guarantee you we're going to see some prospects being traded this year, so I didn't feel the need to include them. Obviously, we'll kind of get into that a little bit later as we keep moving, but, I think a good way to set the stage, some players that might be available, whether that's through free agency or trade. I think some players the Mets might look at might be like a Dustin May, a Pete Fairbanks. Maybe they want to go to free agency, look at a Brandon Woodruff or a Shota Imanaga. I don't think Shota is really a very viable candidate for the Mets, and we'll get into that later. But, other guys maybe like Tomoyuki Sagano, someone who I'm personally really high on. I don't think you have to spend a lot of money. Maybe a Pablo Lopez, a Joe Ryan. Or really what I think they're going to do is try to go out for an ace. I see this team trying to make a move on Skubal if he's available. Definitely trying to make a move on Luis Castillo, someone who's been rumored to be traded to the Mets for seemingly a few years now. I could see Luis Castillo being moved to the Mets. Maybe a Jacob deGrom. The Mets somehow try to throw their hat in that ring, giving up a third base prospect like Vientos or something for a deGrom and maybe a little plus. And then finally, I think one of the last real aces the Mets will be able to obtain is like a guy like Freddie Peralta from the Brewers. He had a phenomenal season last year, has been a very consistent, very good starting pitcher, someone who would immediately step into that ace role, so I would love to see Freddie Peralta join the squad. And maybe a lesser pitcher, maybe we see the Mets have a nice little reunion with Luis Severino, someone who had some weirdly unsuccessful year on the A's. The A's, a very young and up-and-coming team, but I could see them moving off of Severino, trying to get some more prospect talent, something the A's love to do, just acquire, and never really do anything with it. But like I said, I could see Severino being moved. I could see him staying, so that one's a little weird, but I figured to mention it. Now, we'll get into some of the bats here. Corner outfield and center field, that's going to be something the Mets definitely want to hit on, especially if they're going to try and look to move Nimmo to a more of a DH position, just, with the injury concern that he carries and really the amount of years left on that deal. So I think guys that the Mets might make a run at, I'll mention Cody Bellinger and Kyle Tucker, but I really don't think these are going to be two guys that the Mets really make a strong run at unless they're able to move Nimmo. I just think that $20 million a year deal until 2031, it's pretty much 5 years, $20 million a year for Nimmo. I don't see them signing another corner outfielder for similar types of cash unless they either have a really, really solid plan for Nimmo or they know they're going to move off of Nimmo. So we'll keep it moving. Other guys, one more guy that might be in that list is also Byron Buxton, but he scares the shit out of me. He's way more of an injury concern than Brandon Nimmo ever has been, and that's a crazy thing to say for a guy like Brandon Nimmo, who really does seemingly get hurt at least once a year. So me personally, I like to stay as far away from Byron Buxton as humanly possible. Very, very exciting outfielder from the Twins, just with major injury concern. I could see maybe the Mets make a move for Luis Robert Jr., a guy who's been rumored with the Mets. Maybe they try to go after a Taylor Ward, someone who's more of a role player in the final year of his deal. Would be very cheap. Another guy, maybe Jarren Duran. Jarren Duran was a rumor at the previous free agent deadline, at the previous trade deadline to be moved. So I could be intrigued into a Jarren Duran type of deal. Don't forget Brenton Doyle, really a great center fielder for the Rockies. 2-time Gold Glover in his young 3-year MLB career. I could see the Mets trying to trade for him. And then the last guy I had on this list was Randy Arozarena. I think he stays in Seattle for the final year of his deal. Really, I think he's a player that Seattle's going to need if they want to make another run. And this feels like a team that wants to keep making a run at it. Seattle's primed to keep going, keep trying to make that play for a World Series. So I really hope they maintain Arozarena on the squad. Now, I looked at first base, and outside of Pete Alonso, it is an uncomfortable position. Josh Naylor was recently signed for 5 years, $92 million to Seattle. So I really have a hard time seeing the Mets do anything else but try to get Pete Alonso. If they don't get Pete, there's not really another great transition at first base. Does that become a Jeff McNeil, Mark Vientos, like, I can't even think of the word. Just a bunch of guys at that position. You're just going to have a group of weird players trying to play first that don't necessarily play first. I hope that doesn't happen. It feels like if we don't get Pete, we're going to be in some trouble here, so I really hope they re-sign Pete. And then I know the Mets have been rumored to try and trade for a second baseman, but really, I looked around. The only one that might be available is Ketel Marte, and I don't think that's a great move for the Mets. You're going to have to give up an Acuna Jr. and more just to take on a Ketel Marte. And this is another guy who's had serious injury concerns. Don't get me wrong, he's coming off of probably the best year of his entire career. He's a great, great second baseman. He's an absolute stud at the dish. I believe he's also a switch hitter, which makes it even more fun. But yeah, he just came off a Silver Slugger batting .283, 28 homers, 72 RBIs, 4 steals. He's not a big steal guy, but really a huge value bat, has been a value bat every year in his career. So someone I really hope the Mets make a run at, but not someone I see the Mets truly making a run at. Now, with that being said, I think it's time for me to give you guys my opinion on what the Mets are going to do this year. Really, I think move number one has to be to re-sign Pete Alonso. I think we got to get this done as soon as possible. I think getting Pete Alonso really sets the stage for the rest of our free agency period and what we're going to do, because not signing Pete makes it feel like we have to really transition this team, really figure out who the hell is going to play first base, and then where that money is going to go. That's $30 million a year, and a player who hits 30 home runs plus 100 RBIs a year. I mean, how do you replace that? So I'm very intrigued to see what the Mets do if they don't re-sign him, but I see the Mets re-signing him on a 4-year, $120 million deal. At the most, maybe he gets a $150, but I have a hard time seeing him get a 5-year deal after Naylor, a 28-year-old, just got 5 for $92. I don't see Pete Alonso's market being dramatically bigger than that. I mean, granted, Josh Naylor just did get $18.5 million a year. I could see Pete getting in the neighborhood of 25. Really, 30's a stretch, but I'm predicting 30 here just because the Mets are in a need with Pete Alonso. We have to get him back if this team wants to stay competitive. Now, I think the second thing the Mets do, I think we're going to look to go out and re-sign Edwin Diaz. I think opting out is more or less posturing for the Mets, kind of similar to the Alex Bregman situation. I think it's more just posturing, trying to get more money out of the team. I could see the Mets going out and re-signing him on a 4-year, $100 million deal, giving him an extra year of security, maybe with a player opt-out at the third into fourth year. But $25 million a year for 4 years, I like that deal with Edwin Diaz. I think the Mets have to keep him in the pen as their closer. If they want to stay competitive, these are two guys they can't just let walk, because without them, this team loses a ton of talent. Now, with that being said, I think third, our third priority here is going to be trying to get a star pitcher, a real stud at the top of the rotation, whether that's Tyreek Skubal, whether that's Freddie Peralta, or for some God forbidden reason, the Reds want to move off of Hunter Green. I think these are really the three guys the Mets have to look at and go, hey, how can we go out here and acquire them? Regardless, I think of which one you get, I think it's going to cost you maybe maybe a Tong and a Vientos, or a Mauricio and Tong. I think Jonah Tong, our Tim Lincecum Jr., I think he's going to be really moved at this free agency period. I just don't see him sticking with the team, unfortunately. But that's going to be the only way to make this team better, is by moving off of fun prospects to go out and get these high quality studs that are proven. The Mets have to make a move on a starting pitcher. They already have a ton of pitching signed. It's not great pitching. I don't like going in here and looking at the pen and going, all right, so we have David Peterson, which I'm okay with. We have Clay Holmes, which okay. We have Sean Manaea, okay. Kodai Senga, whatever that is, please God be good. It's a rough staff, and then thank God we also have Nolan McLean, someone who's hopefully going to hold down the front of that fort. But really, there's just a lot of question marks in this staff, and they need a true number one to shore everything up. Now, keeping it moving, the Mets have had a lot of issues with their defensive outfield this previous season. Really, defensive everything. It seems like they had problems. So I could see the Mets going out and, for thing number 4, going out and trying to trade for Brenton Doyle, center fielder of the Colorado Rockies. Brenton Doyle, he's a phenomenal player. He's played, I believe, 3 years in the MLB and has 2 Gold Gloves playing the center field position. I mean, that's not something you can casually get out of players, especially someone in their 3rd year. He's 27 going on to his age 28 season. Not the greatest bat in the world, seems to average somewhere in the neighborhood of like a 230, 240 average. Not a super big plus hitter. But granted, he's playing in Colorado. There's not a lot going on around him. He's not necessarily getting advantageous opportunities. So this is someone I'd love to see get plugged into an advantageous opportunity, really, really get good time on a good team to be able to hit. He was an effective stolen base guy last year, had 18 steals, 2 caught stealings. He, in the 2 years prior, he had 30 and 22 steals. So this is definitely someone who can move on the base path. And he has a little bit of pop. A year ago, he had 23 home runs. Last year, he had 15. So I would love to see the Mets go out here and try to pick up a defensive center fielder, someone who really has potential to be more than just a defensive center fielder, but really a great, 6-7 bat in the lineup as well. Now, what do I think Brenton Doyle will cost? I wasn't able to tell you what a trade for Skubal or Peralta would really look like, but I did make a mock trade for this Brenton Doyle kid. I think, the Mets giving up maybe a prospect like Jacob Reamer, a first and third base prospect. He's currently number 6 in our system. I think that could get the deal done. Maybe you have to throw in like a Zach Thornton, a number 24 prospect in the Mets system, a pitcher. I believe he's a lefty. I think that type of thing could really get this deal done. To me, that just makes the most sense. Go out there, get a defensive center fielder, get someone who you can put out there every day. You don't have to worry about some of the defensive issues with Soto and whoever your left fielder may be, whether that's Nimmo or someone you have to go pick up, or hell, even Jose Siri. It really just shores up that outfield. So I would love to see Brenton Doyle added to the Mets roster. Now, after this, I do think the Mets need to go out and pick up some relief help. Like I said, outside of Diaz, we're losing 5 other relievers in this staff. So it's definitely going to be a big thing for them, a real huge point of emphasis to go out here and get a couple relievers. Now, who will those relievers be? I think, like I said, I think they're going to get Diaz back, so that's 1 of 5. Then I really, really hope the Mets go out here and they go, hey, Taylor Rogers, I hope you liked it here. We really like you as a pitcher. Great setup guy you are. Would love to see them give him maybe a 2 to 3 year deal worth $10 million, $11 million a year. I think he'd be a great guy to add to this staff. Has a wacky arm angle, not a super easy pitcher to hit. Makes a lot of ground ball contact. Hopefully, I think he can be used and deployed a little bit better in this upcoming season. Carlos Mendoza wasn't really great at deploying this guy. Deployed him in a lot of weird situations where, he pitches to contact and put him in a lot of situations where he wasn't able to pitch to contact, but yet still was a very successful pitcher for the Mets. I would love to see Taylor Rogers return. My number 2 reliever to return, I think we can get Gregory Soto back on a cheap deal. I really, he didn't have a great bunch of outings for the Mets, but I think this is a guy who can be very helpful in a season-long situation for the Mets. Another lefty reliever, has the ability to throw gas. Having him in there with Brooks Raley and A.J. Minter, I think that shores up the lefties in your pen. I think it gives you some solid guys and really gives you some solid options that if it doesn't work out during the year, you're not 2 of these guys don't work out and 1 does, you can go, all right, we got to get 1 more lefty reliever instead of sitting here going, we have no lefty relievers and we're kind of in a trouble situation. So I think re-signing Gregory Soto could be a lot of fun for the Mets, really a nice cheap signing. And then personally, I think the 3rd reliever that the Mets need to look to go get, someone who's not going to break the bank, is Mike Soroka, formerly of the Atlanta Braves, and I believe he pitched for the Cubs last year. He has a lot of talent. This is a guy, righty. He used to be a righty starter for the Braves, went out with a serious Tommy John injury, has worked back, has looked okay. I think, after having a great post-trade deadline last year with the Cubs, I think this is someone you can bring in and look to be a stud reliever, and for fairly cheap. I think maybe you get him on a 2-3 year deal worth $15 to $20 million, and I'm pretty okay with that with Mike Soroka. I think he could be someone who's a lot of fun, someone who really could help add some quality depth to this bullpen. Now, I did have 2 other names listed out on here, and they're not, I didn't want to put in any trade candidates, but I could see a guy like maybe Ryan Helsley getting re-signed on a cheapish deal. Now, was he good on the Mets? No, not by any stretch of the mean. But I do think I could see the Mets trying to take another shot at him, trying to see if, hey, we can recapture that 2021 year where he had 48, 49 saves with the Cardinals. So I could see the Mets trying to take a shot if we can get him on a 1-year, $5 million deal. I don't see the Mets spending into the double-digit millions. So like I said, I'd like to see Helsley back, but it doesn't break my heart if he leaves either. And then the last guy I thought that would be fun to talk about, maybe a Devin Williams. Devin Williams, guy who had a bad year last year, lost some velocity on his pitches, but someone who I think could be a fun addition, could add some spark. Maybe he can find it again and really be a solid reliever for us. I think he'd be a fun 1-year deal, but I wouldn't give him anything more than that. Now, with that being said, I do have a couple more things I wanted to get to, a couple more things that I would do to wrap up this free agency period. I think the Mets should go out there and re-sign Griffin Canning. I think that'd be a huge thing. I think that's, thing number 5 or 6? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, okay, thing number 6. I think they should re-sign Griffin Canning. He had such a great year with the Mets before the Tommy John. I'm very okay with giving him like a 2-year vet minimum contract because I don't think he's really going to get more than that in the market, but someone I would like to see back in this organization. And then someone to add for some starting pitching depth, Tomoyuki Sagano. I will keep talking about him. A ground ball pitcher from the Orioles. I believe I know he's a little older. Let me get a quick check on him. I believe he's 36. Okay, 36. Yeah, so his 35 season, he had a decent year. Gave up a lot of home runs with the Orioles. Had a 4.6 ERA. But in the early doings of the season, he looked good. Someone I really think could help depth-wise. Might be a decent bullpen pitcher at the worst. But, I got weird things for certain pitchers. Him, Eric Lauer. Sometimes you see a pitcher that's not necessarily super high priced, not necessarily having a ton of success, but someone who you could plug and play and would have success within your system. That's Tomoyuki Sugano, someone who I think, could be signed for a 1 year and has some good upside as well as, quality depth. My 7th point, I think we got to re-sign Jose Siri, a guy we can get for relatively cheap, but a guy who's important to this squad, someone who really adds a lot of pop potential. He's got great power. He's got great fielding. He's got a great arm, great speed. Just not always the best eye at the plate. But I feel like the Mets could use another guy who might not have the greatest eye at the plate, could definitely hit home runs, could definitely get some pop, and really is just another good fielder. He's relatively young. Jose Siri had a crazy injury last year. I believe he hurt his femur, actually, which really derailed his entire 2025 season. It was an unfortunate thing. Was only able to play 16 games, but if we can get him out there, I would just love to see what a mostly fullish season looks like for Jose Siri. Not a guy who's had a great batting average in the past, but when he's hitting, he's hot. So I would love to hopefully get Jose Siri back into the mix a little bit on this Mets team. And then lastly, I could see McNeil or Nimmo being moved, but the more I talk about it, the less likely it seems to me. It just doesn't seem realistic. Nimmo has such a huge contract that unless you were going to move him for another huge contract, it just doesn't make sense to me. Like even trying to trade him for Byron Buxton. His contract is $5 million a year more rich than Byron Buxton, and Byron Buxton's only on the books for another 3 years versus Nimmo you got for another 6 almost. So it's an interesting situation. I don't really see either of them being moved. But I do see the Mets really giving up a good chunk of prospects for these guys. I think we do see some prospects get moved out of the Mets system. We do have, I believe, the number 5 ranked prospect system in the whole league. So I would love to see our farm system, put in some work this free agency period. Now, one more. Ooh, excuse me. Apologies. Now, one more thing I did want to get to before we got out of here is just quick little thing. I know there's a lot of quick little, set of expectations, I feel like, for the Mets. That's a better way to put this. We don't know what the Steve Cohen era, this Mets with David Stearns is going to look like. We don't know how this free agency period is going to go. It's going to be interesting. I think they're definitely going to have to learn from their mistakes last year, like the Frankie Montas thing. We're still going to have to carry him, but I think it's going to be a very interesting free agency period. We're going to have to go out there and really get a starting pitcher with some quality starts to him. I think we're going to have to try to avoid landmine pitchers, whether that be a Lucas Giolito, a Framber Valdez, or a Michael King, and especially a Marcus Stroman. I think we got to make sure we don't hit the landmines, and that might be a bigger thing than anything else. But everything's been very closely guarded to the chest. We're not hearing a lot out of the Steve Cohen camp, and really, I hope we hear more. Now, with that being said, as this free agency period kind of moves along, you'll be hearing from me. You'll be hearing updates that I have. If I get any information, I'll be more than happy to share it with you folks. Now, with that being said, we're going to have a very fun free agency period, very stressful one at that, but should be fun. So, I really do appreciate you guys coming out, listening, taking the time, spending the time with me. You don't have to do it, but I do appreciate it. And with that being said, hope you all have a great day, take it easy, and stay idiotic.